It's September 15th, 2022. We're in Silver City, New Mexico, down in the southwest corner of New Mexico at Light Art Space Gallery. And this is a talk about a painting show called Intimations of Immortality. And my name is Paul Hotvedt. I'm the artist for this show. There are 18 paintings here. And I'd like to, first of all, thank people. First of all, you, everyone who's signed in and watching, thank you for coming. Hello to friends around the world, really. I think there are some people maybe in Israel and Norway and the East Coast of the United States, across the United States. Thank you for joining in. I'd like to thank Karen Heimer, the owner of this gallery, for exhibiting these paintings. She has a wonderful space here in Silver City, a wonderful photographer in her own right and educator. What she's done here is truly remarkable, and the whole community is proud to have her presence here in the art world. I'd like to thank Dr. Renee Dupre, who will be joining us in a few moments to talk about poetry and literature and the reason why this show is called Intimations of Immortality, after the poem by William Wordsworth. And I'd like to thank Itra Kennedy, our videographer extraordinaire, who's doing the behind-the-scenes work to make all this possible. Great. Okay, what we're going to do is we've got an hour. We'll see how long we go within that hour. We hope there's some questions and answers. There's some questions thrown at us. The idea here is I'm going to talk for a couple more minutes. And then we're going to turn it over to Dr. Dupre. She's going to talk for about 5 minutes about the poem and the paintings. Then I am going to get back and talk for about 15 minutes about particulars of some of these paintings and some themes that are here. All the while, we have somebody looking at the site, and if you'd like to ask a question, just type it in the comments section on your screen, and someone will ask the question of me and we'll get to those. Well, this show is a show of exploratory landscape works. I love landscape and I love places. The origin of the show was to explore themes in landscape while I am developing another series altogether, which will hopefully be the subject of another talk and exhibition. That series celebrates a kind of hero's journey, focuses on a hiking trail here in New Mexico called the Dragonfly Trail. And there are quite a few pieces in that effort. It's going to take a couple more years to complete, and I thought I really should have a laboratory for experimenting with styles and ideas and notions of landscape. And this is the show that resulted from that interest in doing that. There are about, I don't know, maybe 6 different approaches or notions of landscape in the show. There are imaginary landscapes. These are all done in the studio except for 2 paintings, which were started outside and then edited or worked on in the studio. They all are from 2022 except for 3 paintings, and one of them that's earlier is this one behind me, which has had a couple of different titles. This one was done in 2020-21. Originally it was called What Prometheus Saw, or What Prometheus Sees. And you can see up close, I don't know if we can see up close yet, but there's quite a lot of paint on this guy. And it is an imaginary landscape. In my mind, I was thinking of what the earth might have looked like after it had been scoured by a glacier, or a very primitive beginning, a kind of pre-human landscape. And it has a lot of visceral paint, the kind of thing I really do love. And this was sort of the thematic genesis for a lot of the work. Later on, we'll go to another large painting, which is on the other side of the gallery. After Renee speaks, I'll talk about the genesis in the process kind of way that painting illustrates a little bit more clearly. As the paint developed, all of these paintings started out quite abstractly and in a raw state in the beginning, as I tend to do in the studio. When I'm outside, I have quite a few years experience in painting outdoors, called plein air painting. And these are done in the studio, except for two, as I mentioned. And when I do that, I tend to use a lot of paint and work very abstractly in the beginning. I throw a lot of paint down, I take a lot of paint off. And I owe, if there's any success in here, they're all tributes to the painter's friend of the rag and the knife and the orbital sander. So there was that spirit of never stopping until something got right. And that's the kind of thing I just love doing. Some of the paintings explore themes from landscapes in Kansas. Some of them explore themes from science fiction, as I was reading a lot of Italian author Italo Calvino in his book entitled Cosmic Comics, in which he places people into these absurdly wonderful beginnings of the universe, the beginnings of matter, the beginnings of light, the beginnings of time, the beginnings of space. That captured my imagination greatly. Some referred back to the Oregon coast, which is just a wonderful place to paint, and a wonderful place, period, and the basalt rocks and the crashing surf. Others to like this, imaginary landscapes in time. Some to quiet streams in the Gila wilderness here. The one other painting here takes its inspiration from Thomas Cole's quartet of paintings, The Voyage of Life. Two versions of that exist. One is in the National Gallery in our capital of Washington, D.C. Another pair of paintings refer back to what life might have been like on a Cambrian seafloor. I love studying ancient life and the evolution of life forms on Earth. And not coincidentally, entirely, the Cambrian, if some of you may know, there was an explosion of forms. And of course, forms are what we celebrate, among other things, in painting, in our visual sense. And during the Cambrian period, vision began in earnest. And because of that, the hunter and the hunted, that battle was going on. And species were just vying for existence, and so you have this explosion of forms and types, and so that captured my imagination for a couple paintings. And then there's also a tribute to Basho, a poet, Japanese poet known primarily for his haiku, and one of his wonderful poems about violets, and that was a wonderful thing to work with. So there you have it. There's a number of different themes, and another theme that's not stated in here is about age. And I am an older guy. I'm 66, just turned 66, and I'd like to say something to all of those out there that like the painter, like to do anything. This painting, this show is really about love and continuing to do what you do, no matter what. And let me tell you, as time goes on, it gets better. And I just encourage you to do that. So if you take anything away from here, it's that. Just keep going. It's a wonderful experience. So this is my homage to some of those things I love and the process of letting things come through and paint. Well, I'm going to turn it over now to Dr. Dupre. Renee is my partner in life and in art, and she holds a PhD in English and American literature, 19th and 20th century, from the University of Michigan. So she knows her stuff. And when she saw these paintings coming together, she had some things to say about it. So I'm going to have her come over here and talk about William Wordsworth and poetry. So.
Thank you, Paul. There was a time when meadow, grove, and stream, the earth and every common sight, to me did seem apparelled in celestial light, the glory and the freshness of a dream. It is not now as it hath been of yore. Turn wheresoe'er I may, by night or day, the things which I have seen I now can see no more. That's the opening stanza from William Wordsworth's Intimations of Immortality. Shortly before the show was hung, Paul and I were talking what to call the show. And I'm not sure why, but just the words Intimations of Immortality just came out of my mouth. And he said, that's it. And we realized it was the right thing. In this time, as we've been living through COVID, and I should say that Paul has painted every single one of these since the beginning of COVID in January 2020. He used this time to explore these tremendous themes. I think when we've been talking about mortality, we've been dealing with grief, we've been dealing with sorrow and pain and fear. At the same time, Paul, as he always does, was able to maintain that moment of joy. And we often misread this poem. The poem is often read as just a lament for the loss of the innocence and joy of childhood. But actually, if you read that poem closely and you read it well, the poem comes back around and says, yes, we lose that innocent naivete of childhood joy and exuberance at the sun coming up, at the rainbows, at the lakes, at the trees, all the things that the natural world offers us. But as we lose it, if, like Paul, we can continue to go out there and engage in that natural world, we begin to see it in a way that is even more profoundly beautiful. We begin to see it in connection to our own mortality, and we begin to see the immortality in everything. And to me, that's what these paintings stood for. And honestly, when we hung these paintings and we put a stanza from the poem next to each set of paintings, I wondered, could Paul's paintings hang literally next to and with one of the greatest poems in the English language? And what we found is they more than did. I'd like to conclude with the last stanza from that poem, which I think says it all. And oh, ye fountains, meadows, hills, and groves, forebode not any severing of our loves. Yet in my heart of hearts I feel your might. I only have relinquished one delight, to live beneath your more habitual sway. I love the brooks which down their channels fret, even more than when I tripped lightly as they. The innocent brightness of a newborn day is lovely yet. The clouds that gather round the setting sun do take a sober coloring from an eye that hath kept watch o'er man's mortality. Another race hath been, and other palms are won, thanks to the human heart by which we live, thanks to its tenderness, its joys, its fears. To me, the meanest flower that blows can give thoughts that do often lie too deep for tears.
All right. Thank you, Renee. I'm glad to see we already have a couple questions, and I'm going to get to that, especially an interesting one from Jen. So I'm going to talk to that in a minute or two. Let's go around Itra. Let's go back over here to this painting on the other wall. So oftentimes what happens is I have this studio out in the woods not about 8 miles from here, up in the mountains. And there's 2 small buildings. Each has a porch, and I take advantage of the weather in New Mexico and work outside quite a bit. So these canvases start off on the gravel outside of the studio or on the porch. And this painting, which is, well, you can all see about how big it is. I don't know what the dimensions are, 48 by 52 or something like that, was done almost entirely with some large palette knives. And this is the way that all of these paintings begin. I started painting outside in earnest in 1993 in Kansas. And I painted outside for about 15 years there and developed a number of vocabulary for painting outside. And I was a bit of a plein air snob. I would not work on the paintings after they were done outside. I progressed one painting at a time, and if I wanted to make an edit, I'd change the edits in the painting as I went to a new location. I mean, I'd choose to go to a new location and start something new with those changes in mind. When I'm painting in the studio, there's, of course, you open things up to all kinds of possibilities, and it's not you choosing a place to be, it's this space in between your ears here. So that's quite a lot of material to work with, as you can all imagine. All these places you've been, possibilities. It's as kind of mind-boggling as being in a dream state. You know, you realize, boy, a lot of things are possible. They begin with this kind of energy, and over the last, I've been doing this kind of thing more and more the last 10 years, sometimes being informed by a photograph ultimately, but they'd start out this way. And then over the years, people would stop by and say, well, I really like this beginning. There's a rawness to it. There's something to it. And I figured, no, that was too easy. It didn't take me very long to do. I'm just going to keep going. Or that's your landscape. You can paint that one. I have to keep going on this one. And that was a right decision. But this one in particular, I stopped after a short period of time. And it does suggest a place, but every square inch of it is really that rawness and joy of the first time out, the premier coup, as some would say in painting. And so I put it in the show, and especially a friend of mine, Ed Jaginski, who's a wonderful man. He's works in psychiatry over in Phoenix, and he pointed out some things about this painting. And I said, I really should just keep it and put it in like this. So thank you, Ed, for that. So all of these paintings began like this, and I'd like to step over here to this one painting that's dedicated to the Japanese poet Basho. And I don't know if I'm getting his entire poem correct, but his little haiku says something to the effect of, "Violets, how wonderful on the mountain path." And I believe Renee spoke about the stresses of the pandemic that we've all been living with. And one of the psychological factors that comes into play for anyone is, we can all tend to be very, very hard on ourselves. And I'm no different in that regard. I read this poem by Basho in a moment when I was looking for some meditative space. And I was thinking, that's wonderful. That's really wonderful. I really should be doing that. And I started a painting, and at first the violets were this big. Okay, you see, these are trees now, but originally they were this big. And there was no path here. And this was a little bit less distinct. And I looked at it for a while, and a couple things came to mind. One, I had completely forgotten the fact that when I was painting in Kansas, I was guided by that ethos, if you will, that spirit of violets, a simple thing, how wonderful. And I would even sometimes describe how I painted as being a ditch painter. I would paint just the weeds or the flowers at the edge of the fields, the stuff you would drive by on your way home from work. So I was being unnecessarily hard on myself. Of course, I remember now that's what I was doing. And I changed the scale of the painting so that now the violets, they're just a couple of brush strokes down here. You can hardly see them. These are juniper trees. And then up here is the sky, a violet colored sky, and we're walking into the landscape. And so it became less about the kind of painting I was doing in Kansas, more about the journey, which of course all of these paintings are about. And that inspired me to experiment with this style of going back to some motifs from Kansas. And there are 3 paintings in particular that address that. This is one of them. There's things on the edge of the field. And you can see here the initial brushstrokes of that wild beginning coming through. And then these things on the edge of the field painted quite abstractly coming through and seeing the sky behind it. Now what happens is when I'm painting outside, usually I strive for some verisimilitude in color. Working in the studio, I feel more at liberty to the moment and letting the paint decide those colors. But this is a motif taken from that time when I was learning things about painting outside and still learning about that. There's another painting I'm going to ask Itra to turn around, who's doing a great job holding that camera. This is another expression of that way of painting. All these brushstrokes, all this beginning here, is very much like the wildness of that large painting we started with. But the painting on top takes over. And there you have it. So that's another Kansas painting. Now, we're going to go back across the room. And the last one in that Kansas series is this one. And this is a good illustration of the slipperiness of the subconscious and the at least what I experience is as soon as you try to formulate something and maybe make something out of it, it resists that. It becomes too formulaic and too predictable, and you lose interest. It loses some life. This is a good example of that. The poet Robert Kelly, who I'm a big fan of, he teaches at Bard College, I believe, still teaches at Bard College, has a poem about style being death and finding the measure. This is a good example of that. This painting wanted to be similar to the last 2 I mentioned, but it just came out, like I said, I was losing interest, and on a couple of occasions I would just take it out on the gravel, pour turpentine on it, get a big towel or a bunch of rags, wipe it down, take an orbital sander, just get down to the bottom of it. And during one of those episodes, there was revealed the sky, just like it was right there. I didn't have to touch it. And then it became a painting about night, because that's what the sky was. A lot of times the sky holds the key for my paintings. And for a lot of artists, I believe, the sky holds that key. And it was that wonderful moment where the painting kind of paints itself. So this earthy painting, lots of paint down here, very similar to the one at the very, very beginning of the hour I talked about with what Prometheus sees, that visceral earthiness. This was a completely different motif from Kansas I call Seeing Through. So I guess I lied. There are 4 here from Kansas. This one of looking through these small trees, and I was just falling in love. I started painting a cloud, and all of a sudden the cloud became a sky, and I go, well, that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to paint this cloud. These clouds like they would do in 19th century France. The Pissarro, the wonderful generous Pissarro who did nothing but encourage young artists or young artists of any age. And that, again, the earthiness of the painting down here coming up into the sky. A lot of what I do outside has to do with desire and growth. And I love that idea of things rooted. It's a metaphor for us on earth and our mortality. You get rooted in the ground, but still all this stuff, you can't move around, but you're just always reaching for the sky. And that's what all of these paintings bring that to mind for me, but this one in particular. This one I put in untouched from a plein air moment here. It's the only one like that. Here on the Gila River, banks of the Gila River, just in a sandbar, and that wild scramble of stuff coming up, these sunflowers and end of summer objects. And that's that painting. This painting is an example of the ancient life form. Ancient life forms I was attracted to. You can see elements of Jackson Pollock, of course, with the drips and so on and so forth. But I would start with, of course, that rawness of paint, and I started really almost very violently taking paint on a palette knife or a brush and then whipping it down onto the canvas point blank. And that became these shrimp forms. And then I started seeing larger fishes in them. And who knows? I mean, we only see, probably 1% or less of the fossil record reveals what was actually there. So I just let my mind go there and enjoyed the heck out of it. So there's different layers of life forms in here when you look closely. Its sister painting is over here. And I do love fishing. I don't get to do it as much as I used to. But this one also has layers of suggested life forms in it. And imagine what landscapes, if you go back in the eons, imagine what might have been seen. It's just incredible when you let your mind go there. And there's a lot of great videos and research and archaeology being done that we can see on YouTube. I think that's one of the best uses of the web for me. This painting is taken from the third of the so-called Middle Age of the four paintings in the quartet by Thomas Cole, The Voyage of Life. And it is I don't have an angel in here, I don't have a guy in a boat, but I do have the storminess and that kind of reflection of, oh my gosh, what have I done? I've only got a few years left. One of the painting quotes I took was from Dutch maritime paintings, which often showed ships in storms, and they would have a lightning bolt, and the lightning bolt was often obscured by a rock or a hull of a ship, and the brightness of the white was increased by the imagination saying, well, I wonder what the actual strike looked like. And thank you to those Dutch maritime painters. They're really wonderful paintings. This painting owes itself to a couple of things. One, my good friend and marvelous painter Eric Sandgren of Oregon shared with me an interview with the Yale professor Bernard Chayet. I believe it was Chayet, and in it he had some paintings, some early paintings, and all I remember seeing was a little disc-like blob of reddishness in one of the paintings, and I started painting with this thing almost like a starter flame of a campfire, and eventually that migrated up to the top of this painting and became this kind of galaxy form. And I was thinking a lot here of the Italo Calvino book, Cosmic Comics, and this, I don't know what this painting means, if anything, but I was just thinking of possible worlds. This painting was done out in Saddle Rock Canyon, and I fell in love with this shape in the foreground. And throwing caution to the wind, instead of following the usual dictum of general to the specific, I started painting the living you-know-what out of the background and falling in love with that. And once I had done that, I had a hard time with the drawing and the particulars of the color in the foreground and making that work with the background. So eventually, I simply took the foreground out and made it and put it into shadow, and that was all the painting wanted to handle. So that was it. These two paintings are simply the quietness of water coming through deep in the Gila. And, we're all going through some changes with climate. And believe you me, we need water in places, and in other places we don't need so much water. But when we want water down here, boy, we really want it. And it's a celebration of those times when we get that water, when the dry season ends and the fire season ends. But also the paint, This stuff has to start with paint. There's no such thing, for me anyway, as saying, oh, I got to have this great image. Let's see, blah, 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 blah. It happens like this together with the way the paint is, how that comes about. So now I'm going to swing around, all the way around to these three I haven't talked about yet. This painting I mentioned, my friend Eric on the Oregon coast, I'd go out to visit his annual paint out, Eric's the Sandgren paint out on the coast. I'd been there a couple of times, and boy, there's nothing like standing out on some basalt rocks in the surf, daring the sneaker waves to make this your last painting. And that wonderful crashing of forms and swirling water and noises and so forth. I mean, what's not to like? This is just, the painting underneath started becoming these things. And, there's different ways to look at this painting. Sometimes it's very humorous to me, this blob of rock with all this stuff growing on it. Probably completely wrong geologically and ecologically. There's probably the wrong kind of seaweed, but I just don't care. There's the intimations of a sailboat from another era coming through in the background. But it was really, for me, the energy of the surf there. These last two paintings go back to the Italo Calvino ideas of other worlds and beginnings of things. And this painting kind of is like, and here you see that galaxy form in the upper left that comes again from the Chait. The idea of a person and a rock and a tree being indistinguishable. So this white form became all of those things at once for me. And I just left it. So it was just right. And those are the kinds of things that sort of happen if you're not paying too much attention. So the 3-in-1, in this case, rock, person, tree, at the beginning of some era of time when those things were possible. And then lastly, this large canvas, undoubtedly having to do with the beginnings of matter coming together. And you can see galaxy and star formations up at the top. But this was, they all were joyful to work on. They all were fun to work on. But this one in particular, I think you can see that energy of paint down here at the bottom, which is really, without the top, you would go, what the heck is that? So the top does give you some clue as to what's going on. And I think I've talked about every one of them in here. So That's good. The last time I did a talk, there were 62 paintings in a show, and people said, "Show more of the paintings, show more of the paintings." So I hope we covered that. Now. So it looks like we've got at least one question. I know that, and the photographer and artist Jim Pendergast, I saw, asked a question about what is the difference in satisfaction, if any, or how does your creative soul respond, if differently, if at all, to the plein air painting experience and the working from imagination, and is the satisfaction any different? And I would say at root, no, but then in terms of life, yes, because there is, when painting outside, as you know, anybody that's done that, you're looking for certain times of day, certain times of year, certain things appear only at certain hours or in places. And working in the studio, you realize, my goodness, it can be any time. And that was at first a great shock. So, it was almost like too much. It's like a blind person learning to see, you're like, maybe let's do this gradually. So I realized I'm going to have to start increasing the amount of time I can work, because all these things are now possible. And I am working more now than I had before, and partly because of that, because I'm actually working much more now in terms of actual minutes. And that work is not always paintbrush in hand. It's simply sitting down, walking, it's taking photographs, it's studying, looking at other art, the kinds of things you do. So in that sense, it's just simply enlarged the experience of working outdoors. I couldn't make any of these without the education I got working outside and letting nature bring those forms and things, and being open to that. None of this would be possible without that. So there's a direct link, and the territory simply opens up a lot. There's always the chance to go back and paint outside again, and I suspect I'll be doing more of that too as the years go on. So I hope that answers your question, Jim. I don't know if are there any other comments or questions for me?
Yeah. Jim also asked me a question.
Okay.
So he'd like to know, how do you feel the readers of poetry and the viewers of painting experience the work differently? We process and experience each art form differently, and each live in a different part of our body. At the end of the day, for me, he says, it is both as a visual art form. And, a really interesting question, how do we do it? I know that for me, I often experience it really in my core, both of them. And I think it's such an individual experience of the art forms. And I suspect that each one of us can experience a poem or a piece of art or a piece of dance or a piece of music in all parts of our body and with all of our senses, and that each piece of art brings us a different type of connection. That's my theory. I can't tell you that there's no right or wrong answer. It's a really interesting question. And then we also had a comment from Miriam Tillman, who says, the paintings are stunning and you're not so bad yourself, Paul. So we'll talk about that one. And Light Art Space asks, Paul, I noticed that some of your work is done on canvas and some on print, on panel. Can you discuss how you make your choices? Does the paint respond differently on each surface?
Good question. All of them good questions. Yes. The panel does not give, like canvas bounces. So, this, you can see the wiggle here when you press on that canvas. It's a matter of practicality, really. The panels are heavy. So, I don't know what the ratio, this is a board, but this is smaller than this, but it weighs 2 or 3 times what that canvas does at least. So there's a practical aspect. If you make a large painting on a panel, it's going to be really hard weight-wise on the wall. You have to make special allotments for that. The paintings I did outside are almost always on panel. It allows you great flexibility for doing a lot of different sizes, and get a 4 by 8 foot sheet of plywood or masonite, and you can run that through your table saw and do a lot of sizes and numbers very quickly. So this one, obviously this is on canvas. The on the boards, I tend to work with, like I said before, about rags and sanders and knives and that sort of thing. That the panels hold up much better for that, the canvas, for obvious reasons. You can, you might easily, if you apply the same energy you apply on the board, you might easily go through the canvas otherwise. So, especially with a brush, I tend to get down, and a lot of painting is just knowing what the heck's on the end of your brush, and not just the end, but in the middle and the base of it. So I tend to go sometimes and just bend that brush all the way down to the wooden hand, the metal ferrule, and just get every last bit of paint out, because there's a lot of expressiveness in that depth of the brush. So panel invites that kind of treatment. I know at the also there's another comment from Eric, the painter, who wanted to know about, well, how has working in the studio, I talked about how working outside has affected working inside, but what about the other way around? How has working in the studio affected working outside? And that's a really good question. I'm taking many more chances. My confidence in varying from verisimilitude of color, form, what's interpreted, what is not interpreted, has increased greatly. And I know by nature that painter, Eric, takes those steps. He has taken those steps, and I did a little video on the way he treats skies. And his skies are not always blue. They are suggested by the colors of the land and the forms of the land. There's marvelous things drawn into them. So working indoors has made me lean more towards being able to do that sort of thing. And also in the kinds of photographs I take when I go out for reference photographs. When I first started doing that, it was like, oh boy, I got a camera. I can go anywhere. I can take all these photographs. And I would end up with thousands of photographs, which I still do. But now, the more of the painter's mind is engaged when I'm outside and I'm going, it's not even verbal. It's just sort of, you go, oh, okay, there's something I can work with. There's something I can explore. So working indoors has definitely increased the vocabulary. And it's something I started with when I was a student back in the 70s and 80s. That would be the 1970s and 80s. And so there was that long segment of work I did, then working outside, and then working back indoors again. And so you just develop this language as time goes on. So I think we're coming close to the end here.
We got another question.
Another question.
This is from Bert of Architecting.
Oh, yes.
It seems you begin with very real, natural features and take off from there. Do you think you are creating places that, however imagined, could exist?
Yes. Hi, Bert. Bert Haverkapens is a fellow hiker, walker, chronicler of places in Kansas and Lawrence. I know he takes a daily walk down to the Kaw River, as the Kansas River is called up there. And he blogs about that, and he takes photographs, and he writes poems. So I think, yeah, as a human, what happens is, and this is one of the thrills of painting, probably very much akin to writing or anything else, you see that one thing that can be, that one thing that can be something. And I know it's cliche, but it opens a door, and you open that door and you walk through it and you go, okay, all this other stuff can be here too. I think I very particularly mentioned about how those shrimp-like forms came about, that throwing down of the pain, and then saying, oh, this world can be, and there's an excitement to that. So Bert, you're absolutely right on. You see that one little thing and you go, oh, that's how it can expand. Now, sometimes it doesn't work. And sometimes it's like rips your heart out. And then you have to do what has been called killing your darlings. And you have to get rid of it. And you have to start over again. But that essential element of one thing being and then going, oh, look at that. By visual sentience, you expand from there, and then it becomes a world of its own. So good question. Good question. So we're good? All right. Well, again, I'd like to thank everybody involved. Each of the cameraman, Dr. Dupre, Karen, and thank you all for coming. And it's really marvelous to be able to do this. I hope we can do it again sometime. And have a great evening. I thought that went really well. We did a similar thing a few months ago in January or February up in Los Alamos, and learned a lot from that experience. So I think that at that time I just walked in and we worked with tech people from the county up there, which was great. This time I was able to find a guy in Itra, and I had the opportunity to work with him a couple weeks beforehand, so we started talking about possibilities, and we structured the hour a bit differently, a bit more carefully, and I like that. Also the smaller number of paintings. There were 60 some in that show, and it was a lot, and it was also almost a labyrinthine kind of space. This is a simple, small gallery, and that facilitated easiness of moving around, looking at different images. Definitely helps to have an expert come in and talk about literature, which I could never pretend to touch. I am a reader, but I don't have that depth of knowledge. So that was also pretty cool. And thanks to Rosiva, who kept a friendly dog from wandering into the gallery, but that would have been fine too. So all in all, I'm looking forward to doing some more.